Hey guys, it's Leanna with Little Lullaby Photography again. Some of you had seen this image on, I think it was Newborn 101, and asked about some texture overlays. And I've received this question before, so I thought maybe we should just edit an image with a texture overlay so I can show you how I do this. So here's the final image that everyone had seen. Here's my raw image straight out of camera. I had bumped up the exposure on this quite a bit. You can see plus 60 on here. That's quite a bit from what I normally do, but this was just a little bit darker than I wanted it. That is the only change that I made in my camera raw settings. So I'm going to open up the image. From my previous tutorial, you guys know how I extend my backdrop, so I'm not going to spend time explaining that. I'm just going to go ahead and do that very quickly. This one has a huge piece on the top. That right there is the main reason why I added a texture overlay to this. Besides the fact that the dress, I just feel like the dress really called for it. Can you guys hear my kids back there? It's Sunday, so they are having fun and screaming and running around. Right now what I'm doing is just smoothing out some of these bigger, where there were wrinkles in my seamless paper or anything that I'm just not too thrilled with. I'm not getting very detailed because I am going to do that overlay, and it's gonna help with most of these. But just doing kind of an overall smoothing, nothing really big. I'm using my healing brush for this, copy pasting. All right, I'm content with that. Now, typically when I do an overlay, I like to do my work on the image first and then apply the overlay towards the end. I'm still doing some touch-up down there. And also this little area right here I'm not too happy with, so I am gonna work on that just a little bit, not a ton, so that looks a little bit better. Actually, I think I'm gonna bring this, we're gonna switch over. I'm gonna go to my spot healing and see if I like this better. I actually like it worse, so we'll go back. All right, I'll just leave that for now. Once we add the texture, I'll decide if I want to do anything else to it. Okay, so typically on an image, I will zoom in and I will work on blemishes first. And I typically use my healing brush for that. So I'll just go in and very quickly go over some of these, the larger blemishes where the light has caught that. This is a very dramatic lighting, so it's not very smooth on the skin, and it tends to show more blemishes than something, than a softer light would. So there's a little bit more touch up on here than I would typically do on an image. All right, that is pretty good for where I want it. All right. The next thing I run on this is I like to use portraiture. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with it, but it is a wonderful tool for smoothing. It's not a cheap tool. It is something that you have to invest in. I find it well worth it. I tend to use it on, I think, every image. I don't think there's an image where I really don't use it. I'll go through here and create a second layer and then run portraiture. And that way I can go through and erase it where I don't want it. I'll typically erase it off of the eyes and the mouth, so it's not too smooth or too soft there. Once I've done that, I do add a sharpening action. I use the sharpening action out of Greater Than Gatsby, the Newborn Collection 2. And I'm using the subtle one. I don't like too much of a sharpness on my images, but just enough so that when you print it, those details are going to pop. And you can see that how they're popping here versus here. Just brings out some more of that detail. One other thing I didn't like how this flower was sticking out on her, so I went through and took that off. But For the purpose of this video, it's really about the texture, so I'm just doing a quick edit on her. I'm not too concerned about it. I am going to right-click and flatten this image from the sharpening. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up my texture. And I use texture overlays from KCC. I love their overlays. And for this particular one, I actually use two, and I'll explain why. Let's scoot this guy over here. This is the one that I started with. So I am going to just grab this texture, drag it over, and then I'm going to deal with my my rotation. So we're going to go to transform, rotate. I'm going to drop that on there, and then you guys know I love my command button. Command T, stretch it out till it's the right size, and then just double click on that to place it. Alright, so now we have a 100% solid layer over the top of the image. You can't see the image at all. Next step, and this is personal preference. On this particular, I've got different opacities that I set all of my overlays to. On this particular overlay, I like it at a 40. Play with it, see what you guys like. You can change that so easily, just sliding it and seeing, okay, do I want it really strong? Do I want it barely there? And like I said, I'm happy with about a 40 on here. So I applied that, and then you come over and you want to add a masking layer to that overlay. And all this does is it allows you to brush on or brush off this overlay. So right now the mask is white, so you would click on your brush tool, change your brush to black, and I'm going to use about a 50-60%. Make sure your brush size is smaller than her, and you start to brush that off of her. This is a really simple thing to do. The biggest thing is that I learned was how to use that masking layer. It wasn't something that I learned in college, and so when people were talking about adding layers and whatnot, it was an incredible amount of work if you start here and you erase. Because if you erase and you just slightly go over the line over here, now you have to start the whole thing over again. So this was the biggest time saver, is learning about these masking layers. So hopefully you guys are doing this right off the bat and you won't have to waste as much time as I did in previous years. And I just zoom in so that you can really get into the details and see what you are erasing. And if you happen to go over too far, let's say you come over here and you're like, oh, well, I didn't mean to do that. All you do is switch back to the white and put it back on. That's why I love that masking layer. So I take it 100% off of my person, and then I'll show you my next step. I'm not going to do this perfectly because you guys can work on that. You get the general idea. But I'm going to show you what I did and why I chose to do it with this layer. Let me go through and just finalize this, and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. How simple is this, right? So easy, and it doesn't have to be perfect around the edges. Okay, on this image, I love the light on her face. I love how this side of her face is dark. So she's got this nice deep shadowing over here, and that's why we call it dramatic lighting, because it's very bright on this side, very dark on this side. And that was done on purpose to create more of a dramatic look. The thing that I'm not happy with, if I had a smaller modifier, which I need to get in my studio, I would have modified this light so that it only hit right here and just touched on her belly. Okay, so that's what I would have changed while I was shooting if I had the modifier that I wanted. Okay, so my modifier is really big, and so that light fell on her face, it fell on her chest, it fell on her stomach, it even fell here on her leg. Okay, so I would have preferred to have the light fall here and then just drift off onto her belly, because her belly is the main subject, right? Right now, I feel like her belly and this top part of her leg are kind of jumping out at you. And so you've got a couple of options, but since I'm using an overlay already, what I did is I went ahead and used the overlay to darken up that belly. So make sure that you're still over here on the masking layer. Go back to your paintbrush, and I'm going to go down to like a 10% somewhere in there. And what I did is I just painted over, adding on some overlay to her stomach area and this leg. You see how that's just darkening it up a little bit? And I also added just a little bit to her bodice of the dress. Now, as I'm doing this, you can see that there's definitely some, I'm not being really particular, and there's definitely some getting on her skin. So after I'm done doing that, because I wanted it to be very even, as you paint it on, you don't want it to be splotchy. So that's why I went further over than I needed to go, because it's easier to come back through and erase where you don't want it. You see that? Much easier to do this afterwards. Okay. Now all that did was darken up just a little bit. I don't want to take the light off of her belly. But you see how that just made it just a little bit more subtle, a little bit more soft and pretty. And I'm going to go back up just a little bit here. Can you see that? It's a very subtle change. And that's about it, guys. That is how I do my overlays. Now, the other thing that you have to watch for when you use any kind of a dark background is banding. And so when I saved this image and uploaded it to Facebook, and you know how Facebook compresses images, I wound up with some banding over on this side. Okay, and so because of that banding, an easy fix was I went ahead and I grabbed this additional overlay and threw it on top, and I actually darkened this one up a bit. It was a little bright for me. I threw that over the top and I did the same exact thing. Okay, so I think this one's at 30%. Yeah, it's at 30%. So that's how I got that final look. Of course, I added my masking layer and did exactly the same thing as I did to this masking layer. Took it off of her completely. But that got rid of this banding over here just by putting some texture on top of that seamless paper. Computers just can't always handle that. So even if it prints fine, which that would have, when you see it on the computer online and everything's compressed, the pixels and everything, it just can't handle it. So I went ahead and added that, and that's how you get to that final image that you guys saw online. Now, mind you, I've not erased this off yet, obviously. Put this back over. The other thing that I wanted to touch on, and I'm gonna make this layer invisible just to touch on it briefly, is when you add a texture overlay, if it's on fairly harsh, like above 30 or 40%, it can start to look like the subject is floating. And so sometimes I will come in with my brush at a low opacity, like between 5 and 10%, really low, and I will make my brush really large, and I will brush a little bit off near the ground and slightly around her. And what that does is it just allows the picture to keep the depth, how it has the natural, let me go back to my pointer, how it has the natural shadowing behind her here, that, that gives it the true, real look. So you don't want to lose that completely, and sometimes an overlay can take a lot of it away. So just watch that as you're playing with your overlays. But go ahead, grab an overlay. You can get an overlay on Etsy for like $2. So just go buy one, go download it, throw it in Photoshop, play around with it, and then show me what you guys did. I would love to see your creations with different overlays. And both of these overlays were actually colored, and I just turned them to gray for this image. So there are so many options. Let me know if you guys have any questions, but I do want to see you guys actually use and apply this and show me what you did. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your weekend.